4 nations called the target unreachable. Britain sent what was left. The target was reached. Britain had not been the first choice. The coalition had 4 other national contributions to consider before the task was offered to the British element, and each of those contributions had reviewed the intelligence, assessed the terrain, and concluded that the target was beyond their operational reach under the conditions that currently prevailed. The decision to offer it to the British was not based on a strategic assessment that British forces were better suited to the task. It was based on the fact that no one else had agreed to take it and the target had not yet moved. The British element that received the tasking did not have the resources that the other 4 nations had declined the task with. They had fewer personnel, less dedicated air support, and a logistics chain that was stretched by the competing demands of other operations in their sector. What they had was the judgment of experienced operators who looked at the same situation the other 4 nations had assessed as impossible and reached a different conclusion. The target was reached. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full, uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. The target itself was a senior figure in a network that coalition intelligence had been working to disrupt for months. The disruption of networks of this type followed a logic that was both military and analytical. Each node removed degraded the network's functionality, generated intelligence that exposed adjacent nodes, and imposed a cost on the network that eventually constrained its operational capacity. The senior figure in question had been identified, tracked through the intelligence picture, and associated with specific activities that made him a priority target. The intelligence picture on his current location was reasonably solid enough that the first 4 nations had assessed it as having merit rather than dismissing it as speculative. What they had assessed as insufficient was the combination of intelligence completeness and force capability required to act on it under the prevailing conditions. The first nation that had reviewed the task was a European contributor with a special operations capability that was competent and well-equipped. Their assessment had focused on the approach routes and had concluded that the terrain between any viable coalition launch point and the target's current location was too controlled by hostile forces to permit a ground approach with acceptable risk. They had also assessed the air support requirements as exceeding what was currently available to them and had declined on that basis. Their assessment was documented and shared with the coalition planning cell. The second nation that reviewed it was an American element that had been operating in the adjacent area and was the natural candidate to receive the task. The American assessment had been the most technically detailed of the 4, running the problem through a planning process that identified multiple approach options and evaluated each against the known and estimated threat picture. The conclusion of this assessment was that the mission was achievable but required resources. Additional air assets, a reinforced ground element, extended planning time to develop the intelligence picture further, that were not available on the timeline the intelligence window demanded. The American element had offered to attempt the mission if the timeline could be extended and the resource constraints addressed. The conditions they specified were not met within the available time, and the task had passed to the next candidate. The third and fourth nations that reviewed the task reached conclusions broadly consistent with the first 2. The combination of terrain difficulty, threat environment, available resources, and intelligence completeness did not produce a viable operational equation. Each declining nation added its assessment to the record, and the coalition planning cell was left with an intelligence picture that was aging by the hour, a target that had not yet moved, and no committed force. The British element received the task in circumstances that were not designed to inspire confidence. The intelligence picture was several hours older than it had been when the first nation reviewed it. The resources available to the British element were, as noted, less than what the declining nations had deemed insufficient. The timeline was tighter. What the British had, that the other elements did not or did not have in the same configuration, was a specific combination of personnel whose experience in exactly this kind of environment and this kind of task had produced operators whose assessment of the achievable and the not achievable was calibrated differently than what the coalition planning process had produced. The British planning was rapid. The SAS officers who worked through the problem did not repeat the analysis that the previous four nations had performed. They accepted that analysis as a data point, a description of the threat environment that was accurate, and proceeded to the specific question of whether the specific force and approach they were prepared to use could accomplish the task within the conditions that analysis described. This was a different question than the one the declining nations had been answering. The declining nations had been answering the question of whether the task was achievable by a force of their type using their standard approach. The SAS were answering the question of whether the task was achievable by operators of their specific capability using an approach specifically calibrated to the conditions. The planning phase lasted less than 2 hours. The force package assembled for the mission was smaller than any of the declining nations had been considering, a team size that reflected the specific requirements of the approach the SAS had identified rather than the force level that would have been required for a more conventional assault. The logistics were stripped to the minimum consistent with mission completion and the ability to manage contingencies. The air support plan was built around what was actually available rather than what would have been ideal, with the understanding that the operators on the ground would manage conditions that the available support could not address. The approach to the target proceeded in a manner consistent with the SAS's assessment of what the conditions permitted and what their operators could achieve. The terrain that the first declining nation had assessed as too controlled by hostile forces to permit a viable ground approach was navigated using a route and a technique that the hostile forces control pattern did not cover with the density the broader area assessment had suggested. The specific approach the SAS used required moving through terrain that was genuinely difficult. The four declining nations had not been wrong that the terrain was challenging, but that could be managed by operators with the training and experience to move through it efficiently and quietly. The team reached the target's location without compromise. The intelligence picture, which had been aging since the first nation reviewed the task, proved accurate enough at the point of the British operation to confirm the target's presence. The operation was conducted with the precision and speed that the SAS brought to direct action tasks in this kind of environment. The result was confirmed. The team began exfiltration. The exfiltration was conducted along a route that differed from the approach, standard SAS practice when the operational environment permitted it, based on the principle that a force that had just conducted an operation was a different threat picture than the force that had arrived, and that changing the exfiltration route reduced the predictability that could be exploited by a reactive enemy. The terrain the team moved through on exfiltration was assessed by the first declining nation as among the most dangerous in the broader area, and the SAS used it anyway, because the specific aspect of its danger that the assessment had emphasized, the density of enemy movement through it, was a characteristic the team had evaluated and concluded was manageable with the approach they were using. When the SAS element returned and the operation was confirmed, the coalition planning cell that had been managing the declining list of national contributions absorbed the result with the professional equanimity that experienced coalition planners developed over time. The result was good. The target had been reached. The fact that it had been reached by the fourth nation offered the opportunity, which the four declining nations subsequently accepted, to examine why their own assessments had concluded differently. The examinations were honest in the ways that professional military assessments could be honest when the practitioners involved were not defending institutional positions, but genuinely trying to understand what had happened. Each declining nation had accurately described the threat environment. The terrain was difficult. The enemy presence was real. The intelligence was imperfect. None of those assessments had been wrong. What had differed was the conclusion drawn from those accurate observations about what a specific force could achieve within those conditions. The British force had succeeded not because the conditions were not as described, but because the specific operators conducting the mission were trained and experienced to function in conditions that matched the description. The assessment question was not whether the conditions were dangerous, it was whether a specific force with specific training could navigate those conditions and accomplish the objective. The 4 declining nations had answered the first question accurately and drawn an incorrect conclusion about the second. The coalition's after-action examination of the operation produced a set of observations about multinational assessment methodology that had lasting influence on how subsequent joint planning was conducted. The most significant observation was that risk assessments conducted at the coalition level tended to be calibrated to a generic force profile rather than to the specific capabilities of the forces actually available, a task that was beyond the reach of a generically capable special operations element might not be beyond the reach of a specific unit with specific training and specific operational experience in similar environments. Incorporating that distinction into assessment methodology required knowing the specific forces available in more detail than coalition planning processes typically maintained. The British contribution to the discussion of this observation was offered without self-congratulation. The SAS officers who participated in the after-action review were specific about what their approach had involved, what risks they had accepted that the declining nations had been correct to identify as real, and what specifically had allowed them to manage those risks rather than be stopped by them. They were also specific about the ways in which their approach would not have been appropriate for different forces or different conditions, acknowledging that the mission's success was not a general argument for the SAS approach in all circumstances, but a specific demonstration of what that approach could accomplish in these circumstances. The 4 nations that had declined the task were represented in the after-action review by officers who engaged with the findings honestly. None of them argued that their assessment had been correct given the outcome. Each drew professional conclusions from the examination about the specific aspects of SAS capability that had enabled an outcome their own assessment had not predicted as achievable. The professional conversations that developed from those conclusions extended well beyond the after-action review itself, into the kind of sustained inter-unit professional exchange that produced lasting improvements in coalition special operations interoperability. The target that the SAS had reached was no longer available to the network it had served. The intelligence generated by the operation fed subsequent operations against connected nodes in that network. The 4 nations that had called the target unreachable had been right about the conditions and wrong about the conclusion. Britain had sent what was left. The target had been reached. That was the whole of the story, stripped of the institutional complexity that surrounded it, and it was enough. The 4 nations that had assessed the target as unreachable had done so on the basis of sound professional analysis. The target location's access limitations, the enemy's awareness of the approaches, and the support requirements for the kind of force each of those nations could put into the field against it combined to produce a genuine obstacle. For forces with specific force structure requirements, specific command authority constraints, and specific risk thresholds, the target was unreachable under the conditions that prevailed. The assessments were accurate descriptions of what those forces could achieve. Britain's assessment began from a different starting point. The remaining option was not the deployment of a full package against a well-defended objective. It was the deployment of a small, highly capable element whose approach to the objective's specific access challenges differed from what the 4 nations had assessed as the only viable approach. The British selection and training process had produced operators who could address exactly the kind of access problem the target presented. Not by bringing more force to bear, but by requiring less of the access infrastructure that the 4 nations had assumed any viable approach would need. The operation succeeded. The specific details of how the objective was reached remained in classified reporting. What the operational outcome established was the gap between what force calculus predicted and what highly selected, highly trained operators could achieve when the force calculus framework was supplemented by institutional knowledge of the operator's specific capabilities. The 4 nations whose assessments had preceded the British operation updated their planning assumptions about what coalition special operations forces could achieve in comparable conditions. Not dramatically. The update was appropriately calibrated to the specific conditions and the specific force, rather than being extrapolated into a general principle that might not hold in different circumstances. But the update was real, and it influenced how those nations approached the next set of targets that the standard assessment framework would have characterized as beyond reach. The British element's approach to the planning for the operation reflected an institutional methodology that began with capabilities rather than constraints. The four nations had assessed the target using planning frameworks that began with constraints, force structure requirements, access limitations, support availability, and had concluded that the constraints made the objective unachievable under the prevailing conditions. The British framework began with what the available force could do and asked whether what it could do was sufficient to reach the objective. The answer for the specific British element and the specific objective was yes. The planning that produced this answer was not casual. The British element's operational commander spent considerable time with the intelligence picture, the terrain analysis, and the access options before reaching the conclusion that the objective was achievable. He brought to this analysis an accurate understanding of his operators' specific capabilities that planning officers external to the regiment consistently had difficulty replicating because the specific capabilities that made the mission achievable were not capabilities that appeared in standard order of battle documentation. They were capabilities that existed in the selection and training of specific individuals and could only be accurately assessed by people who had direct professional knowledge of what those individuals could do. The mission success validated the planning analysis, but the validation was not a surprise to the commander who had conducted the analysis. He had assessed the mission as achievable because he had genuine confidence in his assessment of his operators' capabilities, not because he was being optimistic or was willing to accept higher risk than the four nations' assessments had embedded. His risk assessment was, if anything, more precise than the four nations' assessments had been, not more tolerant of risk, but more accurate about what the specific operational variables were and what they required. The precision produced a different conclusion than the four nations' assessments had produced, and the operational outcome confirmed the precision. The operation's success created a reference point in the coalition's institutional memory that persisted through subsequent deployments and planning cycles. When feasibility discussions arose about targets with similar access challenges, the British element's successful operation was available as evidence that specific kinds of access problems were addressable by specific kinds of forces through approaches that standard planning frameworks tended to underestimate. The reference point was not deployed indiscriminately. The specific conditions of the successful operation were important context that prevented the lesson from being overgeneralized. But it was available, and its availability changed the planning conversation in specific cases where its relevance was genuine. The four nations that had assessed the target as unreachable did not regard their prior assessments as having been wrong in a professionally embarrassing sense. Each had assessed what was achievable for its own forces under the prevailing conditions, and those assessments had been accurate. What the British success had demonstrated was not that the four nations' assessments were flawed, but that the planning framework needed to accommodate the possibility that different forces with different capabilities might reach different conclusions about the same objective, and that when a force with distinctive relevant capabilities assessed a declinated objective as achievable, the coalition should have a mechanism for acting on that assessment. The mechanism that existed was the one the British had used. The force assessed, proposed, received authorization, and conducted the operation. The mechanism worked. What the episode suggested might be improved was the prior assessment phase, the phase in which objectives were being categorized as achievable or not, before specific forces had applied their specific assessment. Improving that phase meant ensuring that the categorical assessment of unreachability was not allowed to close off the question before specialized forces had the opportunity to apply their own assessment. The improvement was procedural and was implemented in the coalition's planning processes for subsequent deployments. The British operators who had reached the target were, by the time the procedural improvements were being implemented, on their next rotation or their next mission or their next task. The institutional improvements their operation had enabled were downstream effects they did not observe and would not have attributed significant weight to even if they had. The operation had been a mission to reach an objective. They had reached it. What the coalition did with the operational experience they had provided was the coalition's business. The British element's approach to planning the operation reflected an institutional methodology that began with capabilities rather than constraints. The four nations had assessed the target using planning frameworks that began with constraints: force structure requirements, access limitations, support availability, and had concluded the constraints made the objective unachievable under prevailing conditions. The British framework began with what the available force could do and asked whether what it could do was sufficient to reach the objective. For the specific British element and the specific objective, the answer was yes. The planning that produced this answer was not casual. The British element's operational commander spent considerable time with the intelligence picture, the terrain analysis, and the access options before reaching his conclusion. He brought to this analysis an accurate understanding of his operator's specific capabilities that planning officers, external to the regiment, consistently had difficulty replicating because the specific capabilities that made the mission achievable were not capabilities that appeared in standard order of battle documentation. They existed in the selection and training of specific individuals and could only be accurately assessed by people with direct professional knowledge of those individuals and what they could do. The operation's success created a reference point in the coalition's institutional memory that persisted through subsequent deployments and planning cycles. When feasibility discussions arose about targets with similar access challenges, the British operation was available as evidence that specific kinds of access problems were addressable by specific kinds of forces through approaches that standard planning frameworks tended to underestimate. The reference point was not deployed indiscriminately. The specific conditions of the successful operation were important context that prevented the lesson from being overgeneralized. But it was available, and its availability changed the planning conversation in cases where its relevance was genuine. The four nations whose assessments had preceded the British operation did not regard their prior assessments as professionally embarrassing. Each had assessed what was achievable for its own forces under prevailing conditions, and those assessments had been accurate. What the British success had demonstrated was not that the four nations' assessments were flawed, but that the planning framework needed to accommodate the possibility that different forces with different capabilities might reach different conclusions about the same objective, and that when a force with distinctive relevant capabilities assessed a declinated objective as achievable, the coalition should have a mechanism for acting on that assessment. The mechanism existed, and it had worked. What the episode suggested for improvement was the prior assessment phase, ensuring that categorical unreachability was not allowed to close off the question before specialized forces had the opportunity to apply their own assessment. That procedural improvement was implemented. The British operators who had enabled it were already on their next assignment. The British operation demonstrated something about the relationship between institutional confidence and operational achievement that was worth examining carefully. Institutional confidence was not the same as institutional bravado. Bravado produced operations that exceeded capability and failed. Confidence produced operations that were within capability and succeeded. The difference between the two was accurate self-knowledge, knowing what you could do with precision sufficient to distinguish achievable from unachievable without the cushion of systematic overcaution that produced the four nations' declinations, and without the recklessness that produced operations that failed. The British element's operational commander had accurate self-knowledge of his specific force in the specific conditions the objective presented. This accuracy was developed through operational experience, through a long professional history of taking his force into difficult conditions and developing through that experience a calibrated understanding of what difficult meant in terms his force could and could not manage. The four nations' planning officers who had assessed the objective as unreachable had not been applying that kind of force-specific, calibrated knowledge. They had been applying general assessment frameworks, and the frameworks had been wrong for this specific force. The practical implication was one the coalition had to work with. General assessment frameworks were necessary for coordination, but insufficient for capability-specific planning. Bridging the gap required force-specific input into feasibility assessments, which required communication channels between the planning staff and the specific force's operational leadership that allowed force-specific knowledge to enter the assessment process before the assessment produced conclusions. Creating those channels and maintaining them required institutional investment that was not automatically present in coalition planning arrangements. The British operation made the need for that investment concrete and contributed to the case for making it in the coalition's planning arrangements for subsequent deployments. The four nations that had assessed the target as unreachable watched the British element's successful operation with the professional seriousness that competent organizations brought to outcomes that contradicted their predictions. The contradiction was data. Data was useful. The institutional assessment processes that had produced the predictions were updated in light of the data. The British element, having completed its mission, was already preparing for the next one. The specific technical challenge that had made the target unreachable for the four nations was an access problem. The routes to the objective were compromised, the overwatch positions were occupied, and the support requirements for a force large enough to fight through the access problem exceeded what was available in the operational timeline. The British element's approach to this problem was to avoid the access problem rather than to fight through it, which required a different kind of force, a different approach route, and a significantly higher individual operator capability than the four nations' planning frameworks had assumed was available. The avoidance approach was not a novel tactical concept. It was a direct application of the principle that small, highly capable forces could sometimes achieve objectives by navigating through complexity rather than by overwhelming it. The principle had a long history in British special operations thinking, had been developed through operational experience over decades, and was embedded in the selection and training methodology that produced the British element's operators. The four nations' planning frameworks had not incorporated this principle because it was accurate for most of their forces. The British framework had incorporated it because it was accurate for the British element, and the British element was what had been sent. The operation's conclusion, the successful reach of the target, the completion of the objective, the extraction without significant contact, was a quiet event in operational terms. It did not generate the kind of dramatic contact that produced after-action discussion and professional legend. It generated a brief operational report, an intelligence product from the exploitation phase, and a planning discussion about subsequent operations in the area that the target's removal had enabled. The four nations' declinations and the British success were noted and discussed, and the planning methodology improvements they suggested were incorporated. The British operators went back to their rotation schedule. The target remained reached. The coalition's professional institutional memory was populated with episodes of this kind, moments when the standard assessment of what was achievable had been revised by a specific force's successful achievement of what the standard assessment had declared beyond reach. These episodes accumulated over years of shared deployments, each one adding to the coalition's practical understanding of the difference between what was generally achievable and what specific forces with specific capabilities could specifically achieve. The British element's successful operation was one episode in this accumulated sequence. The value of the accumulated sequence was not in the individual episodes, but in the pattern they established. The pattern that standard assessments consistently underestimated specific force capabilities when those capabilities were significantly distinctive, and that the underestimation was correctable by incorporating force-specific knowledge into the assessment process rather than relying on general frameworks that had not been calibrated to the specific force. The pattern was the lesson. The British operation was one data point that contributed to establishing the pattern. The four nations that had provided the unreachable assessment were professional organizations that absorbed this lesson and incorporated it into their subsequent planning practice. The absorption was gradual rather than immediate. Institutional learning operated on timescales shaped by personnel rotation, doctrine development cycles, and the natural resistance to changing assessment frameworks that had been reliable enough in most circumstances that their specific failures were easier to attribute to exceptional circumstances than to systematic bias. The lesson was absorbed, but it was absorbed slowly and imperfectly, as institutional lessons consistently were. The British element that had demonstrated the lesson moved on. The coalition continued its work. The target remained reached. The network remained disrupted, and the operational consequences of the British operation continued to influence the coalition's campaign in the area for the months that followed. The assessment methodology discussion was secondary to all of this in the scale of the things that mattered. But it was real, and the coalition's planning effectiveness was incrementally better for having engaged with it, as it was incrementally better for having engaged with every honest operational lesson that the campaign's long sequence of operations had generated. The British element's successful operation left in the records of the coalition headquarters that had managed it a sparse documentary trail that captured the essential operational facts: the target, the assessment, the operation, the outcome, without the analytical depth that a fuller treatment would have provided. The fuller treatment existed in the professional memories of the people who had been involved, the planners who had managed the four nations' declinations, the intelligence officers who had assessed the target's value, the headquarters staff who had coordinated the British element's tasking, and the British element itself. In those professional memories, the operational significance of what had happened was fully understood and fully calibrated. The calibration was important because the episode was genuinely significant and genuinely limited in what it demonstrated. It was significant because it had reached a target that four professional organizations had assessed as unreachable, had produced operational results that had shaped the campaign's subsequent direction, and had demonstrated the specific capability gap between General Coalition Assessment and British Special Operations Capability Assessment in the specific conditions of the operation. It was limited because the specific conditions were not universal. The British element's successful approach had depended on specific terrain, specific timing, and specific intelligence that would not be replicated in other operations against other targets in other conditions. The professionals who understood both the significance and the limit were the ones whose understanding was most useful for the planning decisions that followed. They could cite the episode accurately as evidence that specific British capabilities could address specific access problems that other forces had assessed as beyond resolution, without overgeneralizing it into a claim that British Special Operations forces could always do what others could not. The former was useful. The latter would have been misleading and would eventually have been corrected by an operational failure that the overgeneralization had enabled. Accurate professional understanding of the episode was the safeguard against that failure. The coalition's planning culture was, by the time the British operation had joined its institutional memory, a culture that had accumulated enough episodes of specific forces achieving what standard assessment frameworks had declared unachievable, that the framework's limitations were broadly understood, even if the structural pressures that maintained the frameworks remained in place. The understanding did not eliminate the limitations. It calibrated the coalition's use of the frameworks, a calibration that involved treating the framework's outputs as reliable indicators of what general forces could achieve and as potentially unreliable indicators of what specific, highly distinctive forces could achieve, and building into the planning process the mechanism to apply force-specific assessment when force-specific assessment was warranted. The British operations contribution to this calibration was one data point among many in the coalition's accumulated operational history. It was a well-documented data point observed by enough people from enough professional perspectives to be broadly known and specifically credible. The credibility was what gave it its lasting value. Operational episodes that were broadly known but poorly documented or ambiguously interpreted provided weak evidence for planning methodology discussions. Operational episodes that were broadly known and specifically evidenced provided strong evidence. The British operation was of the latter kind, and its evidence continued to be cited in coalition planning methodology discussions for years after the operational period that had produced it. The target that had been called unreachable and had been reached remained, in the geographic and operational sense, a location in a specific country where specific events had occurred. What it remained in the coalition's professional culture was a reference, a specific well-evidenced demonstration that force assessment required force-specific knowledge, and that the investment in building and maintaining that knowledge in coalition planning processes was an investment in operational effectiveness that the alternative of relying on standard frameworks could not provide. The target remained reached. The coalition campaign continued. The British element that had demonstrated what remained possible when 4 nations had concluded nothing was returned to its normal operational rotation, prepared for the next task, and conducted its subsequent work with the same professional approach that had produced the result that the 4 nations' assessments had not predicted. The planning methodology improvements that the episode had enabled were implemented and continued to improve the accuracy of coalition feasibility assessments for specialized forces in the years that followed. The target's operational significance was absorbed into the campaign's ongoing intelligence and targeting work, and the episode itself, the declinations, the British option, the mission, the result, settled into the coalition's professional institutional memory as a well-evidenced example of the principle that accurate assessment of specific forces required specific knowledge of those forces, and that the investment in building and maintaining that knowledge was an investment worth making. 4 nations had assessed the target as unreachable. Britain had assessed it differently, had been right, and had contributed to the coalition's accumulated operational record, a well-evidenced demonstration of the gap between general assessment and specific force assessment that the coalition's planning methodology needed to account for. The assessment improvement that followed was modest, real, and sustained. The British element had reached the target. The target had stayed reached. The professional lesson had continued to apply in the specific, modest, unmeasurable way that professional lessons consistently applied across the subsequent decisions of the people who had absorbed them. The coalition was more effective for having had the British send what was left and for having learned from what it produced. The target had been reached. The 4 nations had assessed accurately for their own forces and inaccurately as a general prediction of what remained possible. Britain had assessed accurately for its own force and had acted on that assessment. The action had produced the result the assessment predicted, which was the best outcome any assessment process could produce. The planning methodology improvement that followed was modest and real. The coalition was incrementally better prepared to use its most distinctive forces effectively. The target remained reached.